Good morning. Please welcome back to the stage President of the American Academy of Nursing, Bobby Berkowitz.
I think I got ahead of the voice of God there. Good morning. Good morning. Thank you for making yesterday such a wonderful opening day to this year's policy conference. We're back again, back together. For those of you who participated in this morning's new fellow orientation breakfast, I know you had to get up very early, but then so did we. So it was worth it for us, and I hope it was worth it for you. And we're really looking forward to you participating this morning. So we hope you had the occasion to exchange in meaningful discussions with colleagues, both new and old, yesterday and this morning. And consistent with our mission of driving policy, today's two plenary sessions will challenge us to think about nursing and social justice, both in the workforce and in the legislative arena. Please be sure to attend and participate in this afternoon's two policy dialogue sessions. And I would like to recognize the University of Southern California, Suzanne Dwork Peck School of Social Work for generously supporting the first session that includes the concurrent dialogues of cost, quality, and access, the future of ACA, social justice and health equity across the lifespan, and political interference in sexual and reproductive health. Let us thank our sponsors. The second session of the concurrent dialogues, generously sponsored by NYU Rory Myers College of Nursing and NYU Langone Health, include climate change and environmental risk reduction, advocating for vulnerable children and youth, and precision health. While distinct in their subject matter, all of these policy dialogues raise important and unique social justice and ethics considerations, as well as present opportunities for nursing knowledge to transform health. Please remember, policy dialogues are specifically designed to encourage discussion among the panel and among the attendees, so with the objective being to identify actionable policy products for the coming year. Now, please join us for today's first plenary panel, Social Justice, Ethics, and Workforce Issues. So don't forget that if you have a question for our moderator and our panel, you can either do that by putting it on the app, starting now, begin to write your questions, or you can use the pencils and paper at your tables to write questions, and our scholars will come around and collect those. So now it's my pleasure to introduce Thad Wilson from the Conference Planning Advisory Committee, who will introduce the members of the plenary panel. Thad?
How come I didn't rate music? But it's my distinct pleasure to introduce our first panel for today as they address the intersection of social justice and ethics, particularly with a focus related to workforce issues and policy. I think we will be enthused and hopefully a little bothered by some of the things they say today, and will create questions for us. Our first panelist, Dr. Linda Burns-Bolton, probably needs no introduction, but as you will see from the brief bio inside of your program, she has a long and distinguished career with a focus on nursing administration. Our second speaker, Dr. Connie Ulrich, is known for her work in ethics, nursing practice and policy. And our third panelist, Dr. Cinda Rushton, is an expert also in ethics and bioethics. And our moderator for this session, Dr. Rumay Alexander, currently president of the NLN. If you'll see from her bio, I think you will see that she is eminently qualified to lead the discussion with this rowdy panel. Panel, here you go.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Are you guys asleep?
Wake them up.
So I'm leading off this morning, and it's my pleasure to do so. I'm going to be speaking about some work that we have embarked at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation on the culture of health. And that work, which eminently associated with this conference in terms of trying to achieve an outcome where improved population health is possible for all that reside in our country and even in the world. And I'm pleased to be a member of the board of directors of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. This culture of health framework says that making health a shared value is important, a shared value, one that everyone can embrace. Fostering cross-section collaboration to improve well-being, creating healthier, more equitable communities. Equitable communities means that, you know, I grew up in Tucson, Arizona, on the south side of Tucson. And if you know anything about Tucson, the south side of Tucson was where the poor people lived. And more often than not, they were African American or Hispanic. So we want every community to be available to individuals and have the possibility of achieving well-being and equity. And the fourth action area is strengthening integration of health services and systems. It's not possible to achieve a culture of health without having systems that are integrated. That includes, for example, the built environment. It includes making sure that people have access to those things that are life-sustaining, like clean air and water. And so health is not just about the absence of disease. I think you all embrace that. The culture of health is about seeking to achieve health equity. So what do we mean by the term health equity? Health equity is the ethical and human rights principle that motivates us to eliminate health disparities. Achieving health equity requires a commitment to fair and just health practice, for everyone. Preparing nursing and health professionals to value health equity to achieve health improvements across populations. Supporting actionable policies to close health disparity gaps, and being respectful and inclusive of groups in the development of programs and services to achieve health equity. So, you know, I'm a product of the 60s and 70s, and I can't tell you the number of different committees I've sat on across this country. And when we were all trying to focus upon the fact that we were a diverse populace, and diversity was the burn word, meaning that it was always used. But now we're much more interested in saying it's not just about counting how many of X you have. It is about inclusion. It doesn't matter how many of X. It's about being inclusive. And when we talk about health equity, we're talking about being an inclusive and social system that everyone has the possibility of thriving. So here are the 8 of the, not all of the facts to consider, but 8 of ones that I wanted to bring to your attention today. 49% of adults report a sense of connection to the community. That's unfortunate, only 49%. 33% of adults do not prioritize investments in community health and well-being. 80% of food product ads viewed by children aged 2 to 5 do not meet federal nutrition standard guidelines, but they're plastered all across all kinds of social media. 51.7% of working families are eligible for FMLA and could afford to take it, but do not. 13% of Americans spend 50% or more of their income on housing. Only 16 states and the District of Columbia have smoke-free air laws. 23 states and the District of Columbia allow full practice for nurse practitioners. Only 23 states and the District of Columbia allow full practice for nurse practitioners. There are 1,499 preventable hospitalizations per 1,000 persons in this country. So we have a lot to work on in terms of achieving social justice. So my question to you is, how can the Academy support a culture of health? What things is the Academy willing to work on? Making health a shared value, fostering cross-sector collaboration, creating healthier, more equitable communities, strengthening integration of health services. Those 4 areas we believe are essential to achieving a culture of health, one where everyone has the possibility of not just surviving, but indeed thriving. Thank you.
Good morning.
Good morning.
It is a pleasure to be here amongst the panel and to be here at the Academy to briefly provide some thoughts about the role of bioethics education and preparedness within a broader social justice perspective. You might be wondering, well, how is bioethics education and preparedness linked to social justice and health equity? And I have to say, I was wondering that myself when I was asked to be part of this panel. But after thinking about that and reflecting about the meaning of social justice and its distinct dimensions such as respect and health and autonomy and critical thinking and attachment and well-being and personal security related to human well-being, we often forget that those who are direct and frontline caregivers, such as nurses, physicians, and others, within the walls of healthcare institutions are also suffering in many ways. There are many inequalities within our healthcare systems of care that impact their overall health and well-being. Nurses face many difficult ethical issues in the complex care of patients and families. On any given day, nurses may encounter issues related to end of life, informed consent or lack thereof, conflict between nurses, patients, families, and clinicians on goals of care, traumatic events, which we have seen this past week with the Las Vegas shootings, staffing concerns, abusive and demeaning communication, and a whole host of other issues. I think we only need to look to our newspapers to see disturbing ethical events play out in front of us. The recent treatment of the Utah Emergency Department nurse by law enforcement, in my opinion, was unacceptably excessive, undignified, and disrespectful. Protecting the rights and welfare of an unconscious, vulnerable patient is exactly what bioethics education and our code of ethics would call for any nurse to do in that situation. We should all rightfully applaud this nurse for expressing discontent with the situation and using her voice to advocate for the social good and justice regarding a patient. I don't know if she received any kind of bioethics education or in-house ethics training of some kind, but she did receive administrative support, and that is important. And she assertively used her voice for social good in a morally distressing situation. No healthcare clinician should be threatened for meeting their professional and moral obligations to patients. Nursing is challenging enough without being challenged by an uninformed individual. But these microethical issues are commonplace, and they beg us to ask social justice questions. First, from a social justice perspective, what is it that we believe is owed or due to our healthcare professionals within the healthcare system? Second, what is it that we believe bioethics education can contribute to the health and well-being of our clinicians? And finally, how well or poorly do our systems of professional training and institutional support prepare and help professionals, patients, surrogate decision makers, and other loved ones communicate about the ethical challenges they encounter within healthcare systems? We know there is stress, distress, and moral distress that often comes with being a nurse, a physician, or other member of the healthcare team, and it is not without physical and emotional scars. And we know that in some instances, clinicians are tired, they are worn out, and in some instances detached or burnt out from the day-to-day problems that they're seeing. And this is costly. The average hospital can lose anywhere from $5 to $8 million from turnover. So we must do better. We must do better. I often wonder, what is it about the system that makes people feel trapped and unwell? But is bioethics education or preparedness the answer? Well, I absolutely think it is necessary, but perhaps it is not sufficient. In my own work, there is evidence to suggest that ethics education is linked to a higher level of confidence, and nurses and others feeling that they are qualified to take action with regard to a particular issue. But those who have little or no ethics education feel unqualified or unauthorized to bring forth an ethical issue. We are very limited in our understanding of the outcomes that we want to achieve and the ethical competencies that are necessary in today's society. We need much more data and we need much more funding as bioethicists to try to identify these outcomes. In some ways, I do believe, from a philosophical perspective, that ethics education can help us. It can help us understand, bring to the table our assumptions, our beliefs, and our values. And it can also help students recognize that there are different ways of thinking, there are different ways of knowing, and we have to respect different cultural paradigms that we bring to the table for these morally relevant conversations. And it can also help nurses gain confidence in navigating the system because it is so murky. So to close my comments, I do believe that designing healthy communities starts with an investment in our clinicians. We need to build a science base that identifies innovative ways to achieve overall health and well-being within these institutional settings. And bioethics education is an important element to achieve that end goal, which is an important end goal for all those who deliver care and for those who are recipients of that care. And I'd like to close with a quote by Dr. James Wagner, and he was the co-chair of the Presidential Bioethics Commission under President Obama. And he indicated that when we strengthen ethics education, not only for future scientists and clinicians, but also for every member of the public, we will be better equipped to move forward as individuals and as a nation. Our hope is that every generation can do better as we face the dynamic future that awaits us. And after I listened to the conversation yesterday and the beautiful testimony by Dr. Laney Burney and her issues that she faced with segregation, I do think that bioethics education is a way forward for us to help us have these difficult conversations in an atmosphere that is respectful and that has civility. So thank you.
So good morning, everyone. It's really an honor to be here with my colleagues and also to be a part of this important dialogue that really calls us to remember why we're doing the work that we're doing and the incredible responsibility we have to the people that we serve to create environments where ethical practice and ethical values can be explicit rather than implied. So I'm going to take on the question of what kind of ethical climate or culture will actually support the kind of behaviors that we aspire to. In many ways, what we're being called to inquire into is what kind of moral ecosystem do we want to create? How do we begin to align the individual interests, the interests of our communities and organizations and society in such a way that our values are not just talked about, but are actually lived and embodied? So when we talk about ethical climate, often it's referred to as the implicit and explicit values that actually drive healthcare delivery. But it also shapes the workplaces where care is delivered. We can't actually separate the individuals who are members of those organizations from the climate where they actually practice. And the question is whether or not those organizational conditions and practices actually enable them to practice with integrity or not. And so looking at the organizational conditions and practices with an openness, a willingness to have these issues identified, discussed, and decided. So the ethical climate in an organization actually embodies the character of that organization. It can serve as a very important reference point for everyone. Members of that community who are serving people in need, who are diverse, who are suffering, and who have an expectation of our service to be applied in a fair, equitable way. It is also a variable, and our colleague Linda Olson has been very instrumental in helping us to understand how we might measure and look at the actual ethical culture and climate in an organization, because it can be used to improve the environment and the quality of care. So in thinking about ethical climate, I would like to propose 3 fundamental values that are necessary to actually create a climate that reflects the kind of people that we aspire to be. First is respect and dignity. And we say those words a lot, but in the essence of respect and dignity, it is the acknowledgement, the valuing of our shared human destiny. It is looking past the external to the essence of who every person is. In Japanese Sanskrit, the image for respect is to treasure every small bit. And that sense of dignity that arises when we are seen and heard and honored is foundational to a climate that supports ethical practice. The second one that has been talked about a lot in these last few days is justice, which can be understood in so many different ways, as fairness, as equity, as inclusion, as non-discrimination, as actually looking at how we allocate our time, our attention, our resources toward those things that matter most. The foundation of both of these, I would argue, is compassion. Compassion can sometimes be thought of as a sort of touchy-feely kind of concept, but I would argue compassion is a very rigorous stance to take. It is to attend to the experience of another, to be concerned for the welfare of another. And it goes beyond empathy, because compassion requires us to intend to improve the circumstance of the other. It is not to be a bystander. It is to take action. All of those values are reflected in our code of ethics. The very first provision says nurses are called to care for every person, irregardless of any unique characteristic, with compassion and respect and fairness. So, as we think about this challenge of creating a climate, the second thing that I think is absolutely essential is that we have to be intentional about how we design our systems. Starting first with being able to identify and live our values rather than just speak about them. Making ethical practice as a core value in our healthcare systems. Creating accountability for everyone, from every person that has a contact with the patient. A non-negotiable norm of respect and fairness. I think we also, in our healthcare organizations, need to engage staff in co-creating system solutions and to engage them in beginning to create a new narrative about who we are, about what our work entails, and to demonstrate the examples not of where justice has failed, but where justice has been upheld. And to begin to look at how we allocate our resources in our organizations toward creating systems and infrastructure for having ethics be central to our organizations, having processes and structures and policies that are intentionally aligned with our values, using them as a screen to determine whether there's alignment or not. I think also to have in place, as Connie mentioned, having in place procedural and structural safeguards. We cannot expect people to stand up and speak out when they are unsupported, when there are not intentional efforts to make sure that every courageous act is supported in a fair and equitable way. And also to put in place routine surveillance mechanisms to notice when there is adherence and celebrate those, but also when there are infractions of those norms so that they can be intentionally addressed. So I want to leave with these three questions for all of us. What values will we embody and embrace? What patterns of speech, decision-making, conflict resolution will need to shift to create a culture that upholds our essential values of respect, justice, and compassion? And what are the specific steps individuals, communities, and organizations can take to begin these shifts? I invite all of us to think what our part is in actually creating the climate, the environment where these values can thrive and flourish. Thank you.
Good morning. I am honored to be with this distinguished group of colleagues and to be moderating the conversation. I am going to encourage you to ask some wicked questions. In fact, we need to hold the courageous dialogue and not talk around the edges, but get to the real heart of what some of the issues are. But as I was listening to my distinguished colleagues, I thought about the title of this presentation that we've got this morning on the panel, and I think I would have played with the title a little bit. And I would have called it, "You Can't Talk Your Way Out of What You Behaved Your Way Into." I'm simply saying we can talk about what are our core values and our mission, but when we don't live them out, the words don't matter. It is really important for us to demonstrate and show how we implement these values. And the work that's being discussed here is really around inclusion, which is a climate issue, an organizational climate issue. In the words of the great philosophers, the Temptations, it is about how you do the things you do, the way you do the things you do. And so this gives us a chance, given that they've given you some things to be thinking about. Think about your admissions committees and how they operate. Think about your promotion and tenure committees, your strategic planning committees. The discussions that go on between colleagues that either cause people to be fearful and not feel safe, and therefore not to speak up. Who do we allow to act badly, and why do we allow them to act badly? And do we hold everybody accountable or just some people accountable? These are all embedded in what was being discussed here this morning. And to get us started, I'm going to ask the panelists a quick question while others are coming up, because we are talking about capacity. So when we talk about well-being, we have mentioned flourishing and thriving, but are there other characteristics to well-being that you could raise for the audience?
Sure. I think one of the elements of well-being is actually integrity. Because when we are aligned with our values, when we are able to be whole and have harmony between what we say, what we do, the decisions that we make, there's a kind of ease that goes along with that. And I think the more that we can intentionally line up all of those aspects of ourselves and be who we really are, that contributes to well-being.
I agree with Cinda that I think integrity is key, and we see this issue of integrity playing out within the healthcare system. So this issue of moral distress for nurses, whereby they feel they cannot meet their professional and moral obligations, it affects their integrity, their ability to provide that care, and then therefore we're losing these individuals within the system because we don't have the resources to really help them move forward. So we have to have a broader discussion, I think, about the issues of compassionate care, I think as Cinda said, integrity, how do we help people maintain their integrity within the system, but also how do we build those resources within the system to help improve overall health and well-being?
Well, when I think about well-being, I think about what is the essence of nursing, which at my organization we believe strongly is the essence of nursing is about human caring. And well-being is about making sure that you are prepared to do that heavy lifting of human caring, and that you're supportive of removing the barriers to human caring at all times. And those barriers to human caring, you can enumerate them, you know them. They haven't changed. Injustice is a barrier to human caring. You know, inequality is a barrier to human caring. Poverty is a barrier to human caring. And if you embrace the notion that what we do as nurses is to hold up and support those policies and practices that will allow humans to be able to thrive, not just to live, but to be able to thrive. And to do that work requires that we do the heavy lifting of speaking out. Well, first show up, you know. There's a lot of folks that don't show up. Show up, speak out, and be willing to be a standard bearer for human caring.
So we have a couple of questions from the audience, and two of them are actually aligned together. Now let me see if I can combine them. Are there specific strategies or policy statements that the Academy should consider or encourage in developing social justice actions?
There's someone holding a question over there. I think that the Academy has done well to speak out about a number of things. And I think it would be wonderful if this body, you know, the board is doing everything it can to uphold the mission of this organization. But it would be wonderful if the body, the members of the organization, even those who aren't members, but those who align with what we're about, would send their thoughts in. What is it that you think the Academy should be doing if we aren't doing? Because the Academy, Dr. Berkowitz and the Academy have spoken out on numerous items, but what's missing? If you think something's missing, you gotta be present, speak out, and let us know. Because I think the Academy would welcome your input. The individuals who make up the board of directors are humans just like the rest of us. We're not all knowing. And so the opportunity to give voice to something that you feel the Academy should support is there. All you have to do is contribute.
I also would like to thank the Academy. I think my co-conspirator in crime, Dr. Ann Hamrick, and I, a few years ago, reinvigorated the bioethics expert panel. So that is an avenue for us to discuss ethical issues that might arise within society or within nursing and broader issues that affect us overall. And we've been charged with thinking about and thinking through those particular issues. So it's been a wonderful experience for us in moving issues forward and to develop policies related to bioethics.
So I would add total agreement with my colleagues. I would add one more thing that I think the Academy might actually have an important contribution to make, and that is this idea of shifting the narrative. I think that we have the platform, we have the evidence, we have the leadership. And one of the key ways to begin to shift our culture, to shift the ways that we actually behave, is to create a new narrative and to lead in that process of not only focusing on what is wrong, which is plenty, but to also begin to hold up as examples people who are embodying the values that we actually want to see, to celebrate those occasions of courage, of standing up and speaking out in ways that begin to shift the way that we talk about ourselves, our work, the challenges that we confront in a new way.
So the audience is taking me seriously on the wicked question. And they're coming fast and furious, so that's great. So here's the question. We are in a climate environment where workforce setting where there seems to be little that is just, ethical, moral, or humane. What advice do you offer for our academic nursing schools in terms of how they should react to, treat, and support their employees and faculty of color who feel tortured, tormented, ignored, dismissed, disgraced, and disrespected in the work environment?
Leave.
Oh, yes. Yes, leave. Yes.
There's no reason. There's so much work to be done in this world. There's so many opportunities. Do not stay in a toxic environment. All it does is it tears down your soul and your spirit. And you don't need that. There are so many other opportunities. I'm serious about that. You know, I said it tongue in cheek, but I'm serious. Don't, you become a victim. And you don't want to be a victim. You want to be able to continue to contribute. That's what this body is about. It's about holding up the multiple contributions all of you have made. You've all been out there doing something to promote human caring. So why wouldn't you care for yourself first? So if you're in a situation, it's like a bad marriage, get the hell out.
I absolutely agree with you, Linda, and our code of ethics suggests that to be the case. We should not be tolerant. We absolutely have the right to leave. We have the right to protect our own moral integrity within any particular situation. So I'm 100% in agreement with you. I would like to say something about the issue of courage. Yes, we have to have courage, but there was a beautiful article by Dr. Ann Hamrick and the late John Aris a few years ago that talked about courage with regards to we shouldn't have to have courage to ask a basic question within an institution or about an ethical issue regarding our patient and suffering or end of life, whatever it might be. We shouldn't have to have courage for that. We should be able to ask that. We have the expertise and the knowledge base to be able to do that. And perhaps there's a problem with institutional justice if we have to have courage in some way. We also need to think about those resources that are available. They need to be known for people to access them, and they have to be sanctioned in a way that one unit, for example, might be able to access or have the ability to do so, but another unit, there might be an unspoken rule whereby you cannot do so. We have to change that mindset as well. So we have a lot of work to do, but I agree, we don't have to tolerate that type of behavior.
So there are a couple of words that haven't come up yet that some are wondering whether or not we're just intentionally avoiding them, and I don't want anyone to think we are. And those words are around legitimacy, being seen as a legitimate part of humanity. There is stereotype, or how stereotypes steal the identity of people and how we deal with that. There is also discussion around, or at least a word that people are looking for, which is implicit bias, and how that implicit bias brings its own level of power and impact. So there are a couple of questions that kind of center around those words and those word choices, not to mention that we have a clash of labels going on in the country right now. And if you think about it, those labels in some ways imply something about the people that the label has been placed on, whether that's true or not. And so the question here is, how do you teach about these items? How do you incorporate these items or these issues and these powerful, impactful ways of being that deal with thriving and flourishing? How do you encourage to get those out and discussed so that there is honest, true, courageous dialogue about these issues?
So I'm glad to respond to that question. In the course that I teach just this week, we took on the topic of justice. And at the beginning of the course, we have a discussion about our norms of how we are going to be together. And some of those norms have to do with wholesome speech. We use the elements of, is it true? Is it beneficial? Is it necessary? Is it kind? And that doesn't translate into politically correct. It is an intention of, am I bringing my voice into this conversation from a place of kindness? And the final criteria, is it the time and place for this message to be delivered? Those 5 criteria we use to discern whether what we are about to say is needed. We also have an agreement around confidentiality, because if we don't have a safe space for people to be vulnerable with one another, we will not have honest conversations. It's also important that we are not afraid as faculty to engage in those questions, which means we've got to have the capacity ourselves to self-regulate, to be self-aware, to be able to manage strong emotions, not as something to extinguish, but actually something to use to inquire into. And that kind of environment, I think, is absolutely necessary for us to be able to make progress, to welcome the hard topics, not to run away from them, and to be willing to be in the messiness and the discomfort that they provoke for all of us, but at the same time to model the ability to stay with the difficult conversation rather than to shut it down. Because a lot of times what we do is when we feel uncomfortable, we distract it to another topic, we avoid it, or we ourselves become outraged and our own amygdalas get activated. And we react, creating an environment that only fosters more negative emotion rather than insight. So I think we need to practice creating those kinds of environments together so that students, that we can make good on our promise that we are actually willing to be in those kinds of difficult conversations, not to fix them, but to learn ourselves from the people that we are serving as students.
You know, I think it's very important that as leaders that we practice being circle callers. And if you haven't read Christina Baldwin's work, I highly recommend it to you. Circle calling is where you make a space for all to be able to give voice. You create a space where all can give voice. It doesn't say you have to accept all voices, because there's going to be differences. But there has to be a space where people feel comfortable speaking up. And the great leaders have always been great circle callers. I won't say who's in the White House right now is a circle caller, you know, but those individuals who create open spaces for the differences of opinion and thought, it is in those differences, in those conversations, that positive things can arise if we promote that. So I am one who is very supportive of trying to find ways where all voices can be heard. And when all voices can be heard, solutions lie in the collaborative, not just in a single voice.
And I teach both in the nursing school and also in the medical school, and I often find that students will come back to me and say that there is just such a disconnect. There's a critical gap between what I am teaching them from a theoretical perspective and what they are actually seeing in clinical practice. And we need to do much better to close that gap. Part of that is mentorship within the clinical arena. We don't have solid mentorship within the clinical arena. I can speak to my own niece, and I've told this story to some of my colleagues, who is in medical resident, but she was in medical school, and she was in the operating room. I don't know if there's anything about attending surgeons, but she was asking a question, and he asked her, well, are you related to the anesthesiologist? And she said, no, why? Because she asks dumb questions too. And she went on. She was standing there for a 6-hour, 7-hour surgery, and she was trying to, you know, maintain her dignity and be respectful in the situation. And then she went on to ask a further question, and the attending said, well, I don't know. He asked her what specialty she was going to go into. She said pediatrics. And he said, well, I don't know why we're wasting our time with you then. So mentorship is really key. People follow those types of behaviors, and if those are the types of behaviors and attitudes that we are portraying to the next generation, we have problems, and we need a much bigger dialogue on these particular issues.
So how we're socializing
Yes.
students.
Yes.
As well as preparing them for all of the wicked questions they're going
Yes.
to, and situations they will be involved
Yes.
in. So here's a question on bullying. Bullying is a major issue in all of society. What do you propose as interventions and policies to be implemented in our academic institutions and our care provider institutions?
Well, bullying is not tolerated by me as a leader, and that is a principle that the executive team, whether it's in academia or in public health or in clinical care services, has to speak out about. That there will be no tolerance for individuals who seek to belittle, you know, not just bully, but to belittle others. And setting that as a core value of the organization. And, you know, every other Wednesday morning at 8 o'clock, I'm welcoming new employees. And the 30 minutes that I have with them is the opportunity to say to them, here's who we are and what we stand for. And here's what we won't tolerate. And I give them an opportunity at that time, since it's their third day in the organization. So here are our values, here's what we stand for, here's what we won't tolerate. And if those of you cannot support it, you can pick up your purse and go home. You know, because we are not going to allow individuals to be a part of our organization that doesn't respect human beings, all human beings, that doesn't uphold the value of being inclusive, and doesn't uphold the value of being just. So here's your opportunity. Today, I've been doing this for a while. No one has picked up their purse and left. But they have thought about it. And in fact, 2 Wednesdays ago, a group of individuals said to me in that a new employee orientation that this was the first time in a hospital which made me very sad to hear, that they'd heard from the chief nursing executive. They worked in many other hospitals and they had not heard from the chief nursing executive. That made me very sad, because the only thing leaders have to do is to uphold the basic principles that are about that organization. So they have to speak to those principles, and what better time to do it than for all those who are joining the organization. So I assured them that when I'm on my rounds and you get pushed towards me, because I'm on my rounds, I'm going to take a staff nurse with me into that patient's room. Don't be afraid. I'm going to be there to support you, and I'm going to model the behaviors that I spoke about in that orientation. And that's what leaders must do. They must model, whether they're in academia, public health, healthcare, social work, it doesn't matter. You have to model the values that you want your individual employees to be able to adhere to.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that certainly is about behaving and not just trying to talk your way out of something that you behaved your way into. I want to make sure you all hear that. Is it possible that one person's well-being could be lethal to another? If so, what are the limits to well-being? That's quite a question, huh? Is there a limit to well-being? And I'm not sure if part of what's underneath this is this whole notion of treating everyone the same is treating everyone fairly. Where we're not accounting for differences, and what is fair to one in a certain situation and a different situation creates inequity and unfairness. So I think that may be underneath it, but I think also underneath it is this sense of, where do I draw lines? It's almost like the question someone asked me as they were diversifying by number, the presence of different groups. And I actually had a physician to stand up who was a dean. And he said, so how many is enough? We had a conversation outside.
Well, I think it's important for us to always try to find common ground. And that takes a lot of effort. So someone else may feel uncomfortable, while others feel comfortable or just. But you have to find a mechanism where everyone will feel comfortable speaking up, at least. You can't address something that someone won't speak about. So if you're feeling bad because someone said something, or made a statement, or acted a way that was not comfortable for you, and you don't speak up about it, then we can't address it. So when I say common ground, I mean trying to be as open as possible and to let people know that you're not going to judge them simply by them speaking up. You want them to speak up because you can't address issues unless they're out there up front.
Can I ask Linda? Linda, do you think, nurses are, in many instances, with regards to moral distress, people feel powerless. They don't feel as though they have a voice to speak up. I guess I'm wondering, do you think we need, from an educational perspective, training in communication 101, so to speak, and also negotiation skills, perhaps maybe organizational skills, understanding system change, evidence-based practice within that kind of system?
Right. I do, very fortunate to have at my institution a whole team of individuals, nurses, doctors, social workers, who have been there for individuals, and employees feel that they can speak to those individuals. They're not their supervisor, they're not the individuals who directing them every day, but they are ethics champions. And the ethics champions, one of the ethics champion is retiring at the end of this this calendar year. And in coming to me to tell me about her retirement, she wanted me to know, here are the 10 or 12 individuals who are going to be continuing to hold the banner. And they're the ones that you might consider, because her position is a paid position as an ethics champion leader, you might consider replacing me. You know, it's not about any single individual. It is about setting a sense in the organization that you want to hear the voices, and sometimes you're not going to hear it directly, but you might hear it, you know, might have a peer who's been trained, who's willing to do that. And Marilyn Shirk in my organization has trained, you know, over 100 peers to be there for employees. So you want the nurse not necessarily to have to go through massive education, but you want them to know that their voices will be heard. And sometimes that voice will be heard through another individual.
Yeah, and I think people should have the ability to go where they feel safe
Yes.
and talk to whomever
Yes.
they feel safe with. That's for students as well as faculty and staff, because we are talking inequities of power.
Yes.
And so you, to some degree, the leveling of power with power in the discussion is very helpful. We've got about 3 minutes left, and you've got several questions here. So I'm going to play with a couple of them and see if we can squeeze them in really quickly. And if one of you will just address one, and then I'll go to the next one. The rights of nurses and nurse faculty are often overridden in the name of workload necessity to care for patients, to sustain a budget. Those on the front line rarely have the benefit of transparency in regards to workload and workload allocation and budget allocation. Any thoughts on this from the panelists?
So one thing I would say is that the budget of an organization is the most important ethical document in that organization because it reflects what we care about.
Yeah, it's the most truthful, yes.
And I think we've got to hold ourselves accountable to how that budget actually aligns with our values and to explain how it does or does not. If our patients are our primary obligation, then we should see that our budget reflect that.
Excellent.
I think budgets are, and every finance director will say this to you, or at least I hope they will. Budgets are just a document that says this is what we think the allocation of resources will be necessary to be able to achieve the job. You know, it's very rare that you hit it, you know. So it's a living and breathing document. And what you have to be able to do, though, is speak to what will happen if we move resources to point M versus point A. And what are you going to achieve by allocating those resources to M? It's not just about saying I want to spend more money here for X, and making that business case. And individuals who get that understand flexible budgets. You know, I have had many opportunities to play with budgets over my career. And what I've done each year is, whether I'm leading an organization like the Academy or I'm running a health system like Cedars-Sinai, it's the same thing. You have to say, what are we trying to achieve? And what resources will be necessary to achieve it. And that may mean that sometimes you're spending less over here and more over there. That's what flexible budgeting is about.
So we have more questions than we have time. It's kind of like my purse. There's more to buy than there's money in it to buy it with. And so with that, thank you for these courageous questions. Please join me in thanking this wonderful group of panelists.